Let's get going.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of FES India and Prajna to the series of webinars that we are doing on gender and the changing world of work. Uh, it's we have a very old and a very close partnership with FES. So they, we over the years we've deepened this by doing things mainly in the area of women in work, whether it's consultations around workplace rights or last year we did a series of programs focused on workplace sexual harassment itself. So it's this year um, in this new medium. And when we first started talking about this, we didn't have a Zoom account, so it was all predicated on theirs, and then now we do. So the world is entirely different for us too. We're very excited to have you here in these very precarious times. Um, I think even on a day-to-day basis, it's very hard for all of us to think about where we are and uh, what is going to happen next week. We set up these series of webinars and we set up meeting appointments. We do all of this, but we really don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so it seems appropriate that we start talking about how the world of work is changing and how it is changing in a gendered way, differently for different genders. It's particularly apt that we should begin by talking about precarity itself. You're going to find out very quickly that I'm out of my depth. I'm not an economist. And but I have like many adults, I have an intimate knowledge of precarity. And I am delighted that our panel has Dr. Lakshmi Lingam, Dr. Kalpana Karunakaran, and we were to have Rima Nanavati from Seva with us, but she wasn't able to be there because she's not well. I would like to start by reading out and introducing bios and introducing our speakers. But before that, Jyoti or Damayanti, do you want to come in for a minute and say something? Yes.
Since Jyoti is not saying anything, I'll just come in and say hello to everyone. And thank you, Swarna and Prajna, for having organized this series of webinars based on gender and employment. Women in Work has been one of our focal points in the gender unit in the work of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And the people who know FES would may be familiar with the fact that we are a foundation based from coming from Germany and work very much on the values of social democracy, and that's how we take the mandate for gender justice from social justice. And more about FES, I'm sure all of you can find in the website, and also I won't take more time on that, but really happy that all of you are here and look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making this possible and urging us to put it together. We might have just, been ranting and not taken the ideas or concepts any further. And I also want to mention Dr. Shakti, who has been part of Pratnya since 2012 and is now postdoc at IIT Madras, who actually wrote the concept note and the concepts and sent everybody briefings and readings and all of that. So she's been my tutor for this series, and I wanted to acknowledge that as well. So let me read out the intros. Dr. Lakshmi Lingam is a professor and dean of the School of Media and Cultural Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Dr. Lakshmi has undertaken several research projects and published extensively on gender, health, development, urban poverty, women empowerment, and public policies. She's a gender expert, trainer, teacher, researcher, and academic administrator. And Lakshmi, you sent only this much, but then I copy-pasted from your official bio. So, Dr. Lakshmi was a scholar on the International Visitors Leadership Program of the USIA, a Fulbright New Century Scholar during 2004-5, and a Nehru Fulbright Fellow in 2015. She was an Indo-Shastri visiting scholar associated with the University of Montreal, visiting fellow Gender, Sexuality and Law Fellowship Program, Heal University. Dr. Lingam is on the curriculum advisory boards, executive committees, and academic councils of several Indian universities, as well as a member of technical and ethical advisory boards, internal complaints committees of academic, governmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations. In addition to her outstanding teaching and research activities, she has contributed to gender and equity mainstreaming activities of government departments in a number of states in India. She was the General Secretary of the Indian Association of Women's Studies during the period 2000 to 2002. Dr. Lakshmi was a member of the National Resource Group of the Government of India, Mahila Samakhya Program for Women's Empowerment under the Ministry of HRD. Dr. K. Kalpana, and I have to now stop and tell you that when we do programs on women, development, work, labor, poverty, the first name that goes on our list is Kalpana's. So, for Prajna, from day zero, she has been much more than a bio. Nevertheless, I'm going to read her whole bio out to you. K. Kalpana is Associate Professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, IIT Madras. Her research lies in the domain of gender and development. Her published writings are in the intersecting fields of gender, poverty, microcredit, women's labor in the informal sector, trade unions, and collective action in solidarity economies. Kalpana was awarded the Young Faculty Recognition Award by IIT Madras for excellence in teaching and research in 2013. Kalpana's book, Women, Microfinance and the State in Neoliberal India, was published by Routledge in 2017. She was a member of the National Executive Committee of the IAWS for the period 2014 to 17. Kalpana participates actively as resource person in workshops and campaigns for gender equality, including ours, labor rights and human rights organized by women's movements, trade unions, and rural development NGOs. She also participates in capacity building exercises of governmental bodies such as the State Rural Development and Panchayat Raj Department, State Institute of Rural Development, and Tamil Nadu Women's Development Corporation. As an activist organizer with the People's Science Movements and the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, Kalpana has had extensive experience working among microcredit or self-help group federations and right to health campaigns that included public audits of rural primary health centers and people's health status. So welcome to this webinar. Let me ask the first question. In any case, it's a fairly generic one. In the work that you have done, and both of you, I think this is the remarkable thing about most Indian academics. You really rarely only an academic in the traditional ivory tower sense. So in your lives, in your work as activist academics or academic activists, what have you observed about the precariousness of lives and livelihoods in the experiences of those you have worked with?
Ms. Kalpana want to go first, or shall I go first?
In any way, anything. Actually, you can start.
Yeah. I think one of the things that linked to the question and just trying to directly plunge into looking at the COVID times. Soon after the lockdown got announced at 8 p.m. on March 23rd, I remember I got out also to see whether I have to fill diesel in my car, whether I should withdraw money. But I had seen across the board lots of queues and all that. And then it really hit upon everybody about the presence of migrant workers, and also all the informal sector workers who either have not received their payment or are completely at the mercy of getting wages every day. And I'm linked with several organizations, and I started seeing that already there are lots of posts coming up about providing relief, and provision of relief is about many things. It's about food grains, it's about wheat flour, it's about providing kerosene, it's about sanitary napkins, because practically if everything is shut, where would you get these basic provisions, right? So trying to work towards making these provisions available and also raising money to be able to make these provisions available was one. And then we are also part of several e-groups, and then you started seeing lots of mails about migrant workers on all highways, and also huddled around bus stops where there are no buses, etc. And I think the underbelly of India's globalization just came into the open. It's like they're all out there for you to see and recognize that this country runs with the unpaid, or let's say underpaid, absolutely invisible individuals with no social protection, and they are just there. So they are absolutely the ones that we say, with the head above waters. Everyday wage is what allows them to keep their head above waters. Not having one day's wage is like they're already, the water levels go up. And then you also find across the board in all these communities, again, another distinction in terms of able-bodied individuals being able to at least run around and see if they can get relief, versus people with, old infirm people or people with disabilities completely left on their own to survive. And it also happened at the heat of summer, and this whole idea of stay home, stay safe, and stand in the balcony to beat your plate to, show your camaraderie with doctors. No, where is the balcony? There's hardly a room. And in the heat, it's so difficult, and with power failures, etc., so difficult for these homes with small 10 by 10 feet with 10 people, 15 people. And in cities like Mumbai, where workers actually inhabit the same place but work round the clock. So at any point of time, there are just 5 or 6 people in a room. Now suddenly, all of them have to occupy the same place. So just being in that place itself they can risk each other, because there's no social distancing. And then they have to share everything. They have to share toilets. There's no water inside the house. So this understanding that you have electricity, you have running water, you have your own toilet, and then you can keep washing hands several times because there's running water. A lot of those assumptions just were not available. Won't really work for a large majority of people, who have all these precarities at various levels, in the sense, no regular home, no toilet, no water, no electricity, and no internet to gain access to any information. So you and I can work from home. You have a laptop, you have a desktop, you have broadband connectivity, you have internet access. They can't do any work. And these are also the kind of jobs where physically they have to be at the place of work to work, whether it's a service job or it's a manufacturing job. And these can't be broken down and moved into homes. So, it really had opened up the levels of precarity, and also the groups that have privileges that make all the policies. Stay home, be at home, and 4 hours is good enough for you to be prepared for a major lockdown that's still going on, right? So it just, I think, opened the Pandora box of invisibility, Pandora box of undermining the existence of poor in this country. I think there's no other way of demonstrating it but the way it got demonstrated, soon after the lockdown was announced. So I think, as an individual and as an academic that works with several groups, I just kept seeing what's coming up, whether it's Andhra, whether it's Telangana, whether it's Maharashtra, whether it's the Bhuj, the Rajasthan, not Rajasthan, the Gujarat regions. the levels of, spiral levels of poverty and huge threat of starvation was really something that hit us much more than other times. Yeah.
Kalpana, do you want to?
Sure, but are we going to watch the videos now or the
Why don't you say something and then the videos are ready.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, sure. So since Lakshmi has sort of forefronted the COVID context of precarity, what may be useful for me to do is to supplement what she says by drawing all our attention to the structural sort of existing, already existing vulnerabilities that define the conditions.
Closer to the mic. Yeah.
Okay, yes. That define the conditions of work for the masses of the working poor in our country. In fact, even this, I thought it would also be, interesting for us to understand how precarity becomes, or precarious work sort of emerges as an important context in the concept in labor studies, in the social sciences, in the sociology of labor, in a developed country context, where from the 1980s and the 90s, we have neoliberal economic reforms and macro reforms inspired by neoliberal economics completely eroding protections for labor. So sort of removing a regime or dismantling a regime of some degree of existing very hard-fought, hard-won statutory protections for labor. So in a sense, completely transforming the nature of the social pact between labor on the one hand and capital on the other. Right, and some would call it the Fordist production, and a certain Fordist social pact that went with it that then collapses. In our context, of course, the question would be that what we recognize, so therefore precarity then becomes a useful lens to understand conceptually how the world of work is transforming, right, with casual work, contract labor, modes of employment that are temp work, as they are called, or temporary work, home-based work, especially for a lot of women workers, then emerging as very important modes of employment in developed country contexts. In our context, then, just to sort of place our perspective in view, we have 2018 data which says that 46 crore workers in India, of whom 32 crores are working in the informal sector. So that would, lead us to believe that 9 crores is working in the formal sector. But actually, of this 9 crores, 5 crores are contract employees within the formal sector. Approximately 5 of 9 crores are working in conditions of informal employment, even within the formal sector. So that's a total of 42 crores, right? And as Lakshmi was saying, that's a staggering number of people. It's an 89% of India's working population that is in the informal sector. So with all the textbook definitions of informality, right? And we have a government report constituted by this government in January 2019. So, a year before COVID, a year and some months before COVID, which says that 2/3 of workers in the informal sector's working poor, do not earn a minimum of 375, the rupees 375 daily wage. That is the recommended, that was then the recommended national wage to be able to meet household needs, the minimum wage, to be able to meet basic needs of household consumption. So if it's 2/3 not earning that already, right? So I think precarity in our context is really the structural vulnerabilities that every day confront informal workers. And just to add to that, it's not just low wages, it's also the absence of social security, accident insurance, maternity benefits in the case of women workers. And here, of course, I just want to add the point that there are now state governments like Kerala, like Tamil Nadu, that offer, that have welfare boards for unorganized workers that may offer, with whatever degree of efficacy, social security protections. But we must keep in mind that as workers, in their workplace, they remain unprotected. That's the most important thing. They remain without access to, because these other social security schemes are extended to them as voters, really, as citizens who have the power of the voting numbers, not as workers. So as workers, they remain absolutely unprotected. And as workplace rights, these are not part of their essential workplace rights. So I think that would be, where the structural context to where we found ourselves in at the time of COVID. When COVID hit us, this is where we were. So, yeah.
Okay. So my second question was, really about old and new forms of precarity, and Kalpana has already touched on this a little bit. Some types of work, especially in the informal sector, have always been precarious. And of course, there are also, the sort of the hip new incomes of the liberalized economy in India, where people, the gig economy jobs, uh, are also precarious, but we didn't notice them when things were going well. So, what has actually changed in terms of the nature of precarity in recent years, say post demonetization, or particularly because of COVID? So, how has the nature of precarity changed, or has it changed?
Um, the way Kalpana has already laid out, talking about the fact that we already were in a context where the regime is of precarity. Okay. And if we were to track back a little bit and look at this, from the early 1990s, we have been into a globalized world. India has adopted the liberalization, privatization, and globalization framework, and also has opened up its markets. Now, that's also the period when steadily the entire manufacturing sector started declining. The shift in the economy has been much more towards a financial economy and also in terms of a new knowledge economy, right? So, as a nation, the fact that we had labor intensive manufacturing industries steadily started losing out because of the continuous flow of manufactured products across the board from the smallest to the largest coming from other parts of the world because we had to open our economy, right? And therefore, the unionized workers also then moved into the informal economy. So people who worked in the textile industries, worked in a variety of the plastic industry, etc., now then moved into becoming vegetable vendors or paper sellers or security guards, etc. And then also the traditional artisan communities also could not cope with the kind of influx of supply of completely produced goods, and in the absence of support from the government, many of them also have quit all their traditional artisanal work like weaving, clothes, etc., and they also have moved into the urban economy. So interestingly, when we did research at that point of time in late 90s to look at what are the real changes that are happening, we have found that while earlier there was one income, one member earning an income and others who were dependent, now you actually had more individuals having to work, just for the household to survive. And women often referred this as, you have to run to be in the same place. You don't go anywhere, but you just have to keep running. You're on a treadmill, right? You are at the same place, but you're all the time running. So while it looked like overtly there's an increase in employment, the actual figures did tell us that this is a kind of what we often refer to as a jobless growth. There is growth, there's a huge increase in consumption, etc., and overall you could see a huge shift in the kind of stuff that people are able to use and throw and reuse and buy, etc. But the underside of all that is across the board people started losing out on what is seen as a steady job, steady employment, protection, pensions, support by the employer towards their health. A lot of that just got wiped out, and all that in the name of what is understood as flexibility. Yeah, flexible elasticity of labor and flexibility. So you'd be able to hire people easily. You can fire. So the entire understanding of the trade unions and the presence of trade unions, a lot of it has been in a way, legislated in such a way that they got completely, they lost their presence, and it's in a way they got also criminalized. If you want to protest, you want to ask for a lockdown, etc., you can just lose everything, lose your job, you can be put in prison. And from the point of view of competitiveness, that was not seen really as very useful. Now, in the case of women, they any case were very few in the organized sector. Majority of them were in the informal sector. But when you have men also competing for the same kind of work, women slipped further down and are continuing to be in the workforce, but earning much lower wages. Okay, and the entire what do you call structure of this economy and the work was on the design of precarity. Okay, so we talked at the initial years of globalization, we were talking about feminization of poverty. We were also talking about feminization of labor. But interestingly, there's also a phenomena called feminification of work, which is men's work also now has become like women's work. Okay, insecure, drudgery oriented, monotonous, absolutely insecure, and you just have no continuity of work at all. So that's what women always were in that kind of work. Now men are also in that kind of work, right? So in to attract foreign direct investment, more and more countries went into the race to the bottom. Okay, so India also was in that race to the bottom, and basically it was labor and labor's rights that have been placed upfront for being wiped out. Okay, so interestingly, again, in terms of the concept of precarity, I'll talk about globalization and precarity. I think we are now in a context of globalization of precarity. Okay, globally there is this kind of precarity. It's not that only India is in that kind of context. Many countries, including people, for example, in the United States. If you hear, what's her name, Priya, right? Divya. Divya saying that you can't negotiate because if you negotiate, it's possible that you lose your job. Okay, so everybody then in the United States also, I've noticed, do the work of 4 people, because if you say that this is too much work, boss, they'll just say, you can leave the work, we'll get somebody else, or we'll shift the work to India. That's the kind of threat that's there. So globalization or precarity is really what has come about. And interestingly, in the place of organized work and unionized workers, the globalized scenario in India had actually brought in work which basically is designed to be flexible. Okay, so working from home, telecommuting, the entire call center kind of jobs, or what we also talk about is the cultural jobs, right? A lot of the interesting words about what kind of work these are. These are called creative labor, okay, networked workers, cognitive labor, effective labor, immaterial labor, right? So they're not really producing, they are doing work. And they work on, like, they're either coding or they are doing animation work or they are doing medical transcriptions. So there's a lot of knowledge kind of work which is all being done within a very flexible kind of framework. And now these are the poster boys of precarious labor. Okay, we think that these are new jobs that are coming. So while you see Chandra and Divya coming from very different classes, they are on a continuum of informality and on a continuum of precarity. Okay, it's just a great difference. It doesn't mean that one is privileged 100% and the other is disprivileged 100%. You are in the new economy, there is that kind of very interesting way in which these are sugar coated, completely chocolate coated jobs these people have. And this is the new world of precariat, okay, which is precariousness and proletariat. Precariat, these are all the people who occupy those spaces, and they are workers, but because they are into flexible kind of work, they often think that they are doing consulting work or they are doing work whenever they want to work, etc. But actually, they are sucked into a very large capitalist economy which thrives on this kind of flexibility that everybody has got into, accepting that that's the new norm. So people don't have employment, they have jobs, right? So employment was much more different from holding jobs. So with a job, then you're permanently temporary, right? You have to work from one contract to another, and therefore you find individuals extremely jittery about getting into relationships. Individuals, especially men for that matter, while women probably are told that if you can get a good guy who has regular employment, you can survive. But men's jobs are precarious, women's jobs are precarious. Women let go their jobs so that they can take care of children. So the fact that I would actually, this is something I have to really write, the fact that you have only 26 to 27% of women in employment in India, despite increase in education, the big contribution is the precariat. Okay, precarity of men's employment and precarity in women's employment. And therefore, you would rather have security in your children and their future and their education rather than, float in these precarious boats. Every day you're concerned whether you can keep your job or cannot keep your job. And women, in any case, in these companies, IT companies and big advertising companies or companies that are in media, social media, etc., if they are married and they have children, anyway, they are discriminated. They are not seen as good enough. So you actually then have only younger women being there. And then younger women, obviously with all the intelligence, education, just don't find the men good enough. They are so boring. They want mothers, not wives. And you also have these women actually wondering what kind of security are they going to have in relationships where the men themselves are in such floating jobs where there is no guarantee of the contract being renewed tomorrow. Okay, so I think that's where it is, and that's where we are. All workers are deterritorialized. They're completely, so which union are they going to be part of? They work in a company which is not rooted here, which is not located here. They're completely deterritorialized, right? All the big media companies are bought over by some other giant who is already part of this large capitalist economy. And we have two big giants that are eating up almost everything in this country. Okay, so just to wind up to say that within these two women, who could do better in these COVID times? You'll obviously find Chandra with just no backup. It's only your daily wage and all the multiple tasks that everybody in the family can do, they can survive. The moment you don't have any kind of social protection, you're completely, hanging, not knowing what's going to be tomorrow. Whereas Divya has a social capital, has a family, a backup, a home that probably has already been purchased by her family, an electricity and, a laptop. So when you have at least certain protections in place, when something like COVID hits, you can survive. But when those kind of protections are not there because of your class, because of your caste, because of your location, and state also does not provide for, where do you go? So in terms of what has to be done, I think basically the government has to put in place globalization, no globalization, huge social security framework for everybody. Okay, whether you are in employment or not in employment, you have a secure set of things. You don't have to become poor because there is a COVID. Hello?
We can hear you.
Swarna's image is frozen. Hello?
No, but I'm nodding vigorously.
We can hear you, Lakshmi. I think you're still loud and clear.
Yeah, I think now your image is frozen, so.
Yeah, Lakshmi's image is frozen there.
I can see everyone clearly, actually, on the screen.
Kalpana, do you want to? Yeah, and while Lakshmi comes back in.
Sure. So this is your question.
She's back.
I just got bummed out. I think the internet was very angry that I was saying all these things. Okay, yeah. So that's all. I don't know where you all heard. Suddenly I found all your images were frozen. So I didn't know whether it was a problem on your side or my side. But I got,
madly.
yeah. So, till where did you guys hear me? I don't know.
You're talking about
The social protection platform?
social protection. The
Yeah.
state having to do it regardless of the
Whether you're employed or whether you're at home. Yeah. I can come back again with other points later. Yeah, thank you.
Shall I, Swarna? Yeah, so your question had two parts, and one of that, Swarna, was about increasing precarity in recent times. And then, of course, the most recent, which was that of COVID, right? So, but even before the pandemic, I think over 15 years or so, definitely from the late 1990s and from the early 2000s, one of the big challenges to organizing, to those who are organizing labor, to trade unionists, to collective action movements, has been this increasing tendency for, the sort of proliferation of the informal sector, even within the formal sector, right? So that the boundaries of what is the formal and what is the informal have been dissolving. And all of us, for example, to give you an example, all of us work in institutions. These are educational institutions in big offices. Many of us, I'm sure, in the audience are working in corporates, in hospitals, and so on, in which many of the services of everyday maintenance, what is called housekeeping, cleaning, etc., is no longer undertaken by the institution, but then is contracted out, right? So you have all of this, then all these services then being sort of fragmented and auctioned out, auctioned in the sense that there is a bidding process. Different companies then bid for the rights to, say, clean an institution, to maintain the premises of an institution. And the manner in which they get that contract is by keeping their costs as low as it is possible to keep them. And how do you keep costs low? You pay workers low. And all the women that we see in our institutions, on our campuses, cleaning the premises, all of them are not direct employees anymore, I'm willing to bet, of any of our institutions. So they have no connection with the principal employer. I mean, it's the principal employer. We still use that language, but it's no longer clear what that means from the point of view of the worker, right? There are layers of intermediaries. And even if it's a question of harassment of a woman worker, it's not clear whether the sexual harassment rules of the institution then will actually protect an employee, a worker who's not even on their payroll, who doesn't even show up on their payroll. So this is, in fact, something that we found also with the recent migrant crisis, when none of these big construction companies, and no matter what big giants they were, L&T or any of them, had any of these migrant workers on their roll list. So they had no account. They had no responsibility towards them. Right, all of them were, and the construction industry is notorious for those layers of intermediaries. It's not the principal employer, one intermediary. It's layers of intermediaries that go right down to the worker. And I think this is something that we have. This is also what makes these institutions terrible employers. So there can be very abusive practices within the so-called modern sector, right? And I could give you the example, for instance, of Chennai, where over the last 15 to 20 years, you have urban poor populations being relocated outside the city, several kilometers outside the city, to Kannagi Nagar, to Okkiyam Thoraipakkam, where these tenements have come up in order to house the urban poor. It's women who have lost their employment when the city decides that there must be relocation of slums. It's women who lose their employment because women must be closer to their neighborhoods to be able to find work. Women who used to be domestic workers, who had some kind of understanding, in some cases even caring relationships with employers that they had built up over years, found that they had completely lost that employment. They had to then seek work in the big companies in that in that area, right? And the IT sector companies were terrible employers. They were terrible employers. So they had no responsibility towards this workforce. So you really have employment practices, or what you call non-standard employment, informal employment, in the very heart of the formal sector, very often within the government sector, within the public sector. And the public sector is also is no model employer either. Government units are no model employers either. And completely refusing responsibility for the well-being, for conditions of labor, for minimum wages. So the biggest challenge then of unions is, how do you organize in this context? This is also something that is close to research, more recent studies that have been carrying out. I mean, how do you make a woman worker who's selling like Chandra who's selling tiffin from within her home, or who's selling nighties, doing retail sales of nighties from her home within her neighborhood, or who's working on her street corner. I mean, how do you make her legitimately claim her rights and entitlements as worker, to self-identify as worker, when she's not, in fact, working out of an established workplace? She's not working out of a designated workplace, right? She's not in a factory or a workshop. And this takes us right back to the very pioneering work that Maria Mies did in the 1980s, right? When she wrote about lace makers of Narsapur, and she said they're actually contributing value for a capitalist economy. They're producing value that is being surplus value that is being expropriated in a very obvious, blatant way. But the women are not allowed to identify as workers. Their social identity remains the identity of housewife, and it's perfectly convenient for private capital that they identify as housewife rather than identify as worker. So all of these, I think, contradictions with all these implications for how do we move forward, how do trade unions move forward in terms of building women's identities as workers when they're working out of home, they're working on street corners, or they're working as domestic workers in somebody else's home. I see these as very key elements or key dimensions of the precariat, that the challenges to organizing in the age of the precariat that Lakshmi was also talking about. And then to sort of briefly also talk about the COVID context. I think what COVID has left us with is this staggering, mind-boggling scale of the devastation, right? And you have every study that is now saying that the scale of job loss is simply unimaginable. The scale of livelihood collapse is simply unimaginable. And that's something that COVID has left us with. I mean, think of the fact that India was always a place, Indian cities were always places in which, because slums and middle class tenements were always side by side, you had women in middle class households had access to a low cost labor pool of working class women, right? And who in turn facilitated the employment of middle class women by taking over, cleaning work, care work, and so on in the homes of middle class women. So you had that arrangement, and that was a valuable source of employment for working class women. But now, for the first time, you have a situation in which middle class households are actually telling their workers, do not come home, and we can't afford to pay you. And you have resident welfare associations refusing to admit workers, right? So, and just last week in Chennai, we saw 6,000 workers of the Pentoilalar Sangam, Sujata Modi's trade union, out on the streets, then asking the question of, if resident welfare associations won't allow us to return to our workplace, how are we to survive? The 2,000 rupee per month government dole is not helping at all. So you have a complete breakdown. And I think the scale of what has happened in COVID, the suddenness, the intensity, and the pace at which these jobs have just disappeared overnight is something that has really hit us in the face. So that's something that I would say is the very big challenge that COVID leaves us with. Yeah.
In fact, I'm glad you mentioned the PTS protests last week, because we've been talking to them over the COVID period and listening to their stories, and they're heartbreaking because they were all relocated to the outskirts of the city a few years ago. Infrastructure getting there and back was always really bad. So if you missed a bus, you went home at midnight, or you didn't have a bus to come on time to work, and then it was insecure from the bus stand to wherever their houses were. Now with the lockdown, they've really been unable to get anywhere, and the new housing in that area is not receptive to employing people from the local slums. So, in fact, actually, it's not slums; it's slumboard housing. So we've been hearing their stories of distress, and it's been heartbreaking, because even to come in to get that 2,000 rupees, they have to find a way into the city. They have to find a way to get identification. So I'm really glad you mentioned them particularly. But in some sense, since we are making an effort to think more broadly, I was wondering if you had observations on the gender differentiated impact of this precarity during COVID on men, women, and non binary persons, because we end up defaulting to talking about women quite a bit. And I was wondering if both of you had observations that you could make on a broader scale.
Yeah. The most obvious things that everybody experienced and also kept reading, whether it's in newspapers or lots of posts on Wire, Scroll, etc., is about the silent pandemic. That was the first thing that hit us in a big way. That is domestic violence and the increase in domestic violence during the pandemic times. Specific to India and also many parts of the world. So WHO actually asked governments to, do necessary things to make sure that they have services in place to make sure that women can reach out, and helplines and counseling centers and all, which were not originally part of the emergency list, then were added into the emergency list. So clearly, from a gender perspective, one had seen that women and girl children did started facing much greater domestic violence and also child sex abuse. And the National Commission for Women, Delhi, also had notified that they are having several cases that are getting reported and women are reaching out to them, etc. I think in the case of sex workers and the transgender community, there has been again a very big, outcry about the fact that, which is still continuing, right? Sex workers, how would they carry on with their work when social distancing norms do not allow you to be physically close to someone? So among the sex workers, unions and organizations, I think they have come up with their own protocols about how to be able to continue work despite the COVID-19. Otherwise, you basically have an option of dying of starvation or dying of COVID, and which one will you choose is the real question. And I think in the case of particularly the transgender communities, a lot of support did not reach them. Okay, and they themselves had to also mobilize, asking for support and seeking support and reaching support, particularly a lot of relief related measures. And again, a lot of transgender individuals, particularly at the bottom, survive by begging and also sex work, and that entire thing got shut. So gender implications at the surface level were these, and then we also have read and seen many other things like, overall reduction in quote unquote productivity of women. So when work from home has become the norm, lots of women who otherwise were, being able to go to work, sending their children to a creche facility or having a nanny at home, now are completely locked up with their little babies with no support and also expected to work long hours. Though organizations were supposed to be cognizant of work-life balance, I think because they were at home, there were many more measures to see that they are clocking more hours of work and not losing time doing domestic work. So while men continue to do their work without much hindrance, I think in the case of women teleworkers or women who work from home using their internet and computers, apparently their productivity has really come down, and also women started complaining of mental health problems because they just feel they're not able to cope. Within the academic circles, there were very interesting pieces being written and shared about overall reduction in paper submissions by women scholars. Especially in the early years in academics, young women at the assistant professors, associate professors, especially university abroad, where their tenures are all linked to publications and how many you can publish, etc. A lot of them really were not able to cope with the requirement of submissions of papers for the pipeline of review, etc. So many editors started saying we are getting lesser papers from women, while paper submissions from men increased actually. They didn't decrease, they actually increased. So one had seen, that, and of course, an overall increase in women's work across the board, where you have a collapsing of paid work and unpaid work. And again, just to recall, early period of industrialization, the distinction between domestic and the public, the reproductive space and the productive space, these divisions have come about in the early period of industrialization in the West. So all that is done at home definitely is the part of the emotional labor, care work and unpaid, and everything else outside where you earn income. That is the productive labor and productive work. However, in the globalized period, we already have a lot of the ITES work which moved into home, and the information technology enabled services workers already started collapsing and making that division fuzzy in terms of what is domestic and what is private and what is public. And I think post World War II, it's been the first time once again during the COVID times, the paid and unpaid, the public private, the production reproduction came back again. Yeah. So social reproduction has to continue along with the work of production work. And apart from talking about men having to also share or help women, sharing would be a better thing, but they only talked about helping or maybe posting pictures of, making coffee or, baking cakes. But recognizing that domestic labor can be divided across all members at all times. That conversation is not happening. That conversation is not happening at homes, and that conversation about state supporting social reproduction much more clearly and much more articulatedly and vigorously, also that conversation is not happening. Though the Sustainable Development Goals 5, gender equality, has one of the sub-goal about recognizing unpaid work, that's not really being brought to the forefront about at this point of COVID times. How do we bring that back, that conversation back, is not happening. So I would actually like to, recall that Arundhati Roy actually wrote a very interesting piece where she said that the COVID is actually a portal. So do we carry the old baggage into post-COVID times, or do we want to actually imagine a new world? And I think as feminists, we should push for a new world that recognizes social reproduction and completely publicly provisions it. Okay? And support for workers happen to everybody because women at home also work. So work cannot be seen in terms of paid, unpaid, public, private, but all work is work. And if definitions are a problem, let's call our homes our workplaces. All homes, redefine them and don't call them homes. Just say workplaces. These are all workplaces. Some have walls, some have these private walls, some have public walls. Whatever may be the way that we move forward. But if all work is recognized as work and all work is going to be socially supported, then it's not at the whims and fancies of a capitalist order, but it is at the understanding that we have rights and entitlements, and our governments have to be responsible for every single citizen and not leave us to markets. Yeah.
Indeed. Actually, while you were talking about the men taking photos of coffee, I was thinking about this small survey that we ran. We copied the questions from Nari Samta Manch, and it was really trying to get a sense of what was going on. Everybody said that, of course, men are helping out in the household. And we also asked, what is the work that they're doing? Well, they're doing all the outward facing, the public facing work, buying vegetables, buying provisions, going to the bank, and maybe, sometimes sorting the vegetables out at home. So the work that is done inside, deep inside the home, is still being done largely by women and by girls. So according to this little survey of ours. But Kalpana?
Unmute. Yeah, I hope you can all hear me now. Yeah. So, this question of the gender differentiated impacts of COVID-19, especially on work, on employment, and on job loss, I think was forefronted about a month and a half earlier when the Ashoka University, a team of economists from Ashoka University, examined the data of the CMIE, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, had done these interviews with a sample of about 40,000 households across the country. And that data was studied by a team from Ashoka University, which then pointed to a very clear to the fact that there is both a gender dimension and a caste dimension to the job losses that have taken place during the period of the pandemic on account of the lockdown of the pandemic. For instance, they found that of those, they were looking at data for April 2020 and they were comparing it with a 13-month period earlier, the average of a 13-month period from March 2019 to March 2020. So that was the average point of comparison. So when they looked at who had lost more jobs, whether men had lost more jobs or women had lost more jobs, in absolute numbers, men had lost more jobs, but that was also because more men were in the paid workforce than women were in the workforce. So in terms of absolute numbers, it showed that. Therefore, the more interesting indicator, the more important index becomes the percentage of job loss. And the percentage of job loss they found was, comparing over this 13-month period earlier with April of 2020, that number of men employed had fallen by 29%, while number of women employed had fallen by 39.5%, so nearly 40%. So what this then translates to is that 4 out of 10 women, every 10 women, who were working in the last year had lost their job on account of COVID. And this was less in the case of men, right? And one way, how do we then understand this, right? Logically, how do we make sense of this? I think one thing is for us to keep in mind is that we had a pre-existing vulnerability already. India has been reporting an alarming decline in labor force participation rates of women. This has been the case since the 1990s, and especially so since from 2005 to 2019, during this period, nearly 15-year period as well. And in fact, if you look at the number of women in the labor force in India and compare that internationally, we are 10th from the bottom. So basically, there are only about 9 countries doing worse than us. So 2018 data showed that of the total number of working age, of the total working age population, female population in India, only 26% were either employed in paid employment or were looking for jobs, right? 26%. And that was compared to 80% in the case of men, of working age men in the male population. So this pre-existing, I think, vulnerability is what is now being reflected in the women dropping out at a more alarming rate, losing jobs at a more alarming rate on account of the COVID pandemic. But here, Swarna, I also want to sort of look at what the global scenario is, because the global scenario is not really very different. Globally, women make up about 39% of those who are in paid employment, but women make up 54% of those who have lost paid work because on account of the pandemic, on account of the lockdown and the pandemic. So, and there also what they're saying is this has happened because there is a very clear gender difference in occupation, right? There's a gendered occupational trend, which is men are doing different jobs and women are doing different jobs. It's women who are in the sectors, the service sectors that have taken the brunt, that have taken the biggest part of the hit on account of the lockdown. So it's hospitality, tourism, restaurants and hotels where women, especially in the West, are working in the lower end as waitresses. It's services, it's malls, it's shopping centers, wholesale and retail trade. So all of that, the people come into contact with each other that have now had to shut down. That's where women have increasingly or disproportionately lost jobs and are represented in the job loss. So I think this vulnerability is something that we're seeing across the globe. And of course, with schools and care services being closed. And the ILO said sometime in May that 9 out of 10 children were out of schools. Therefore, that means that it's women who have to quit jobs as well to be available at home to mind young children and to take care of infants and toddlers when care facilities close. So you have all those elements of patriarchy that you were not really able to dislodge before, now sort of rearing their ugly head and taking a toll on women. And we saw that. And with regard to some studies that have been coming from India, they show us that it's basically, and this is something that one also saw in the course of relief work, the large numbers of women who were vegetable sellers, fish vendors, who were running very, very tiny businesses, because women in the informal economy are really at the bottom end of the informal economy. They are at the lowest rung of the informal economy, in the most vulnerable jobs in the informal economy. None of these women were able to recuperate savings. So they had lost whatever little working capital, because every day working capital comes from the previous day's earnings. And they had lost working capital and they were not able to put that money back into restarting their businesses. So I was closely associated with a non-governmental organization which was giving interest-free loans, may or may not be repaid. So not really loans, but small sums of 3,000, 5,000 rupees to hundreds of women, vegetable vendors, fruit vendors, to get them back on their feet, because otherwise they are smashed. They're out of the workforce. They're out of the paid workforce. They're not going to be able to ever get that capital to come back. So these are some of the ways in which I think we feel, we see gendered impacts of the pandemic and of the lockdown. And there's one more thing that I want to also say, which is with migrants going back, reverse migration, going back to their rural, to their villages and homes. The question is, it was their wives, daughters, mothers who were managing farms, who were sort of in farm labor. Then what's going to happen? Because I'm not at all certain that all of them are going to come back, or that they are even going to want to come back after the way in which cities treated them. So many might just say, starving or not, we remain in our homes. That might mean they then take up whatever job opportunities they were, including working on family-owned farms, displacing women from their families from that labor as well, and whatever possibilities of income earning that had. So I think we need to factor that in as well. And of course, the latest labor law changes that we've seen, that the post-COVID recovery means, according to our government, it means that labor laws are going to be axed. It means labor rights are going to be, whatever labor protection regime we had is going to be dismantled, to be able to allow workers to work 12 hours, to allow employees to get their workers working 12 hours. But if workers are not going to be protected, if employees will not be held accountable, employers will not be held accountable for providing lighting or safe transport for nighttime jobs, or toilets on workplaces, or drinking water, and they're going to push workers to work for 12 hours, then guess who's going to be dropping out of the labor force, right? So we have, I think this is the really frightening scenario, that we had women dropping out already in India, that we don't have women adequately in the labor force. And that trend is going to get worsened now with the pandemic. And we don't really have a response to that.
Yeah. My next question, actually, I'm going to append Nalini Khurana's question to that, was related to, is precarity only related to loss of livelihood? In the way that we imagine this panel, and now I think already the discussion is extended considerably beyond it. Has COVID pushed us to think of it also in terms of unsafe work? For example, the healthcare workers in a pandemic like this. And Nalini Khurana's question is, she would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on precarity in the context of women frontline workers during COVID. How has the nature of work and precarity changed for them or not changed for them?
Thanks very much for that question. In fact, the entire COVID response is actually hinged on these poorly paid frontline women workers. And they're not called workers also. They call their ashas, accredited social health activists, because the government is very smart. If it calls them workers, the concern is that they would demand workers' rights. So they are called activists. So nevertheless, many of the ASHA workers are unionized. The Anganwadi workers are unionized. They're also asking hard questions. But but they are the ones who are being really pushed to the forefront with very little safety and security. So they don't really have PPE. They have to provision for themselves with whatever masks. And there's so much that goes on in terms of um, door-to-door canvassing, passing on information, accompanying medical teams for COVID testing, tracking and tracing individuals who have been quarantined. So the work is enormous. The expectations from them is enormous, but the compensations just are not commensurate to the kind of work that they do. So most of them actually are placing themselves uh, as scapegoats, guinea pigs to do this task for the government. And government probably will say on one of the days that another round of Thali Bajao for Ashas. But beyond that, releasing money in time, increasing their wages, providing necessary breaks, giving backup support, a lot of that is just not, still not happening. Okay, so I think it's seen almost like these are the housewives of the government. Again, another extended household work done in the public arena by women. All in the name of women's volunteerism, women's altruism, and reproducing the good women, dutiful daughter kind of syndrome. And all of them, because they have a role to play and work to do, definitely have also got an understanding of precarity, that your only mode of staying on in that precarious job is by working harder than ever. And it's not like if you withdraw from work, you will be called back and given more work. You're concerned that you will be thrown out of work. Okay, so there isn't much of a difference between an IT professional and an ASHA worker. Okay, just that IT professional can stay at home, but the ASHA worker can only survive if she's out there. As I said earlier, the degree is different, but the precarity also, degrees of precarity is different, but precarity is the common thread across the board. Yeah.
Kalpana?
Yeah, so I think Lakshmi has said most of what I had in mind in terms of ASHA workers, frontline workers, women workers among the sanitary workers, because we know that it is women among sanitary workers who do the most unprotected labor, in the sense their access to any kind of gloves or protective gear is likely to be the least. It is because even within that, the gender hierarchy is very firmly in place. So that is definitely a concern. The other thing I was thinking of was also how I think in many of our cities, I'm not sure if this is across the board, the Chennai Corporation, for instance, has roped in a large number of focus volunteers, is what they call them. And I think from what I've been hearing, they've been doing remarkable work in terms of ensuring that families that are quarantined, households that remain under quarantine because a family member has COVID, has tested positive, that those families are still getting access to vegetables, their daily milk, rations, that they're not completely isolated, that they're not starving, right? To keep tabs on them. And also at the same time to ensure that those who are supposed to be in quarantine are actually, adhering to quarantine and not roaming outside their homes. So I believe that in many pockets of North Chennai, in which the pandemic really took a toll in the first few weeks, the numbers have come down primarily because of the remarkable job that the focus volunteers have been able to do in this regard. I mean, working closely with the state. Now, I have no idea about how many of these volunteers are male, female, what has been the gender breakup, because we don't have that kind of, it's data yet. But something that comes to my mind is that's obviously a study that is crying out to be done. Right? I mean, once there's going to be such a rich wealth of experience that these volunteers have acquired over these months, and what were their conditions of work? Were they remunerated to some degree? How many of them were women? And if they were women, what kind of, how were they motivated? For instance, as Lakshmi was saying. I mean, there's many ways in which women's natural predisposition for caring, for domestic work, for taking care of families, the labor of love, as it is called, is then cashed in on during these periods, right? It's supposed to be the social safety net that keeps communities safe. So you can have the most irresponsible macroeconomic policies, but then that create a huge mess. And then it's supposed to be women in low-income communities that who are laboring to somehow ensure that their communities don't completely collapse during stress. So they become literally, it's their bodies, their labor, their time that becomes the social safety net. So to see how that works out during the pandemic is something that we don't, I'm saying that it's a study that is just trying out to be done. It must be done in different locales, different sites, especially in the context of all these new people that have entered COVID containment efforts and in partnership with local governments, corporations, city corporations, and so on. And I think that's something that we need to look at closely. There's one more thing that I did want to also add, which is this dimension of not just unsafe work, but also what is then going to happen to the women among migrants. Because much of the focus, I think, of the media has been on the face of the male migrant returning with family, right, with children, carrying children on their shoulders. But there have been media reports and some interesting reports that I saw on women workers who are boarding these migrant trains to go back to Jharkhand, go back to Orissa, go back to Bihar from Bangalore, many of them working in many of these factories and workshops in Bangalore. And I think from the interviews, the sense I got was that the women were saying, the young women, they were all unmarried, saying that they did not think it likely that they would get the permission to ever come back to these cities to work again. And that for almost all of them, this job meant a getaway from home, it meant autonomy, it meant increased independence, it meant they had access to a mobile phone for the first time in their lives because they could afford to have it. And none of them were certain that they were ever going to be able to come back, given their experience in the cities. And also, the fears are so much more, right, during a time like this for women workers in particular. And groups that had been working with migrants, when they tried to get back in touch with the women workers among the migrants who had gone home, they found that the women no longer had their phones with them. The phones had gone back to parents had taken the phones, or brothers had taken over the phones, right? So they had lost control of the phone as well. So it was very difficult to keep in touch with the women workers. On the other hand, I was also seeing media reports that were saying that matrimonial sites in India are seeing an upward surge in registrations. So parents and families are possibly, seeing that in these extremely uncertain times, right? When uncertainty is the only thing that can possibly explain what's going on. The thing that seems to offer security is good old marriage and the marital institution, right? So then you're trying to get girls, especially parents of young women, working women who may have been fighting to push back on marriage, who may have been fighting for that space to work and live in other cities and hostels, live in the company of, say, maybe other women rather than in the company of their parents, are now going to find those options also being foreclosed quite a bit. And I think just to add to that, I just want to say that one should not be surprised if you see a rise in very reactionary, conservative ideas about women's proper place. Because on the one hand, and I agree with Lakshmi, of course, the fact that now everybody is working from home means that you're obviously disturbing that neat binary of home being women's world and the world of work being men's world. Right, so men work outside, women work at home. So the home is where the invisible, the woman can only be a housewife. Now you're disturbing that, or at least you're destabilizing that by saying home is where everybody works. If you want to stay alive, then you just stay put. You stay at home, and so that's no longer only historical divide then is being challenged. But on the other hand, it's also possibly likely that during a time when jobs are likely to become extremely scarce, you might have this older notion that if jobs are scarce, who's going to get the job? A male worker or a woman worker, right? And there have been studies in South Asia as recently as beyond post-2015. South Asia, not just in India, which show that many of these ideas and ideologies still remain very, very strong. I mean, families, people, men and women believe that if jobs are going to become scarce, there's an economic crisis, then it's men who should get jobs and not women. So we might actually see a resurgence of that, and that's also going to make the future a very, very difficult one for women to navigate. That's just my thoughts on that.
No, I agree with you, Kalpana. In fact, very early in this process, somebody called to ask me about women in work. This was something that I kept thinking, that at the end of every crisis that requires women to come out to the front line, they're required to go right back inside because jobs are scarce, economy has shrunk. I mean, this has been how history has worked, right? At the end of every crisis, women kind of take a hit and have to go back to their old traditional place. I have an I want to read something that Premila Burnett has written. She works for the Blossom Trust, where she's a volunteer, and she's currently working with the Chennai Corporation to survey and register COVID positive cases, and many are girls who lost their IT jobs. So, your question about who are these people, this is one answer. There are other questions from participants, but I'm going to throw in my last question, and then you can roll them all together and take them, which is really about resilience. Um, Not an economist. I come to this from having looked at disasters over the years, disaster studies, and we talk a lot about resilience and learning how to survive a disaster, which this is. There's also the real experience of thinking, okay, so there's precarity and there's privilege that mitigates some of that precarity for many of us. But still, in a situation, for example, where hospital beds are scarce, where health insurance covers very little, there is no safety net. For many of us in the middle class, falling sick with COVID is a financial nightmare, and it will leave us in a completely different place than it found us. So it's something that we need to think of afresh. You're talking about the safety net that the state should build. I wanted to finish my set of questions by asking again about how do you build resilience in a situation like this? What is the role of the state? Maybe the most obvious question. Also going to read some of the comments out from Nalini Khurana that she says, it's an interesting point about the gendered experience of migration. From our work in Jharkhand, we hear that many male returnee migrants are now taking up work in their villages and are not so eager to return to the metro cities. However, women returnee migrants may have experienced a new life, a new sense of identity and freedom mobility, despite all the urban precarities in cities that they would not have experienced back in their villages. So they may get absorbed into the patriarchal family system, life, and drop out of the workforce. Preeti Shekhar says, how can we go beyond analysis paralysis and acquire and secure greater economic freedom for women in a post-pandemic economy? Taking a cue from A. Roy's Pandemic is Portal, feminist economists have been talking for years about making care work visible, yet there has been little momentum in achieving this. In the US, the domestic workers movement has made some strides in making domestic work more formalized and systematized. Should we explore more transnational organizing of women workers? Meghna Menon writes, the current legislations do not provide any protection for sanitation workers and manual scavengers, with most individuals engaged in this field being Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi women. How do we understand precarity in this context in a post-COVID world, especially since neoliberalism is pushing them further to the margins? Would love to hear the panelists' thoughts. So, all the questions are open to you. We have about 20 minutes of time, and I leave it to you.
These are quite weighty questions. I think the question about manual scavengers and sanitation workers is really, a caste question and a class question. There are movement groups talking about how do we change the way cities are organized, where Sewerage continuously gets produced, and you don't really have technologies that can work to clean sewerages, and then you continue to push people into these sewers, and lots of people die. As well as the point about women from the lower caste at the bottom of the pyramid in all the entire health structure. These are serious concerns. So, and interestingly, it also brings together a caste question and also a workers question, right? A class question. So, the need to engage with these, to push for greater social protection, care, introduction of technology to ease work at the same time, technology that does not displace people from work, or being able to provide alternative work opportunities without displacing people from their existing work. I think a lot of this is being thought through, and probably one needs to engage with it much more closely. In terms of, I think the question about mobilizing domestic workers, I think there are two aspects. One is about mobilizing domestic workers, and the other is mobilizing discourse on domestic work. Okay, both are important, because we are only talking about domestic workers, then recognizing domestic work, which includes care work, includes emotional labor. A lot of this will be out of the window. So I think both need to be looked into. Some state governments have come up with specific protection and acts for covering domestic workers, but they have not really done much about it. For example, Maharashtra government had a legislation for domestic workers, but just did not put in place the necessary infrastructure for registering domestic workers, providing them with cards. Nothing took place. So sometimes you have lots of movements then lead to these empty legislations that come and they never get implemented. So I think greater thought needs to be put in place about in what ways are we going to build these discourses. However, the biggest concern that we have at this point of time is economy that is continues to be so exploitative, and also a governance regime that does not seem to be very supportive of people and workers. It is a regime that is very, very supply oriented. It's not about workers. It's even during the post lockdown, the packages that have been put out, the weakening of the economy, strengthening it, was about pre-COVID also, pumping more money into industries. It was not about pumping money into people's hands through Narega or any other form. So we see that entire design continues in the same way. So when we use a word like resilience, basically my concern is people are continuously being tested on their capacity to be resilient, and I think people have demonstrated that they can be resilient. But the point is that what people have to be demonstrating? Because resilience is about your ability to bounce back, right? Now, every time if you bounce back at a lower level, at what point of time are you really going to be above water? You have to keep bouncing to survive. Is that really what we should be looking for? I think we need to change the framework and not really demand people's resilience, but demand that governments change the way they do things for people, and not keep expecting them to jump one more hoop and then jump one more hoop before we give you a chocolate. No, I think people have jumped enough and shown that they can be resilient. And I think that's not the way we are going to demonstrate that we are good citizens. Where is the government and what is the responsibility of the state in a democratic country, and how are the duty...
And that's actually my question. What is the role of the state?
Right. So how are the duty bearers going to deliver all the rights that are there in the Constitution? And how do they take responsibility to see that the economy is put back, on the track without people losing their rights or workers losing their rights? Several state governments, as Kalpana mentioned, have completely repealed, at least 10 states have repealed their labor legislations. And there's a big push towards reducing the number of legislations and coming up with fewer and fewer codes and fewer legislations. And I think even before we know what we are losing, we seem to be coming up with a new scheme of things that are going to get us to lose many more things, and we are expected to again be resilient. I think we should be able to shout out and say, no more resilience, you do your job. Yeah.
So, is my mic on? Okay, yeah. So I absolutely agree with Lakshmi that on the one hand we've had that it's fairly frustrating what this government has done in particular with respect to demonetization, its impact on the economy, GST, its impact on the informal sector, and everything is sort of been taken the form of this sudden announcement with very little time that is supposed to then create this revolutionary change in the economy. And what it does is to leave people feeling absolutely frustrated and without the means to cope. I mean, how does one actually prepare for a lockdown? How could one ever have prepared for what demonetization could have done? And therefore, I think the focus really must be not any more on what it is people have to do for themselves, how people need to get their, bootstraps, get themselves up by the bootstraps, because that's also really somewhere the neoliberal model, that what people need to do, how much more responsible people need to get, etc. And I think all our efforts must therefore be focused on what it is the state needs to do to get its act together in the current state. And I think some important demands have already come up. A number of unions have been asking for it. Some political parties have been asking for it. For instance, the universal basic income. This is a model that is being talked about not just in India but in many other countries. I hope I'm audible. Basically saying that there must be at least an amount of 6,000 to 8,000 rupee that is transferred to the bank accounts of poor households, rural and urban poor households, over the next 6 to 8 months, preferably the next 1 year, because nothing else is going to be able to get households back on their feet. So the need for a universal basic income is something that we must never lose sight of. I think after this, it must inform our language, our campaigns, our pressure building, activities. All of that must be is absolutely important that we don't lose sight of that. And of course, from a gender point of view, how do we ensure that women get access to this? If there is going to be some cash transfer from the state, how do we ensure that it goes to the woman, and not only the woman-headed household, but goes to the woman in whichever household, right? Even if the man is present and earning, how do we ensure that women are able to control that money? So that's something that I think that we have to be pushing for. And of course, other basic things also, like strengthening the PDS, expanding the reach of the PDS, strengthening Anganwadis, strengthening supplementary nutritious noon meal schemes, because there's no way we are going to be able to mitigate women's burden of feeding and caring for families, helping families recover from this pandemic, unless we do it by putting resources in the PDS, in Anganwadi systems, and in school nutritious meal programs and supplementary programs, so feeding programs. So that I think is an absolute non-negotiable, that where we must be pushing towards. And we have states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu that have been the pioneers with the informal unorganized sector worker welfare boards. And many other states too, Maharashtra too, I'm sure, and other states as well, possibly almost all states now. And I think these informal worker welfare boards, at least in Tamil Nadu, were the outcome of construction worker struggles, domestic worker struggles, informal worker struggles, basically saying that we must have the right to our social security protected by the state. And why can't the state in this context use the worker welfare boards to provide recovery funds? You can call it recovery fund or call it something else, to self-employed women workers who need working capital to get back on their feet, to get back their tiny businesses. Right? The only way, NGO interventions can only go so far and no further, will always be regionally limited. It's only the state that can actually ensure that there is a plan to get, reach out to women through the self-help groups, find out which women have lost their livelihoods, and ensure that they get access to recovery funds. So the existing self-help group network, the existing the links between SHGs and banks, all of this must be leveraged to ensure that recovery funds reach self-employed women workers, and I think that's an absolute must. The problem, because the state actually has, the fact that you have these worker welfare boards means that women are registered as informal workers. Women manual workers are registered as domestic workers. They're registered as construction workers, as brick kiln workers, as salt pan workers. Tamil Nadu state has 34 worker welfare boards, 17 of which are, under the control of the Department of Labour and Employment. As it happens, they have been very badly functioning over the last couple of years. Trade unions are extremely upset with the direction that the welfare boards have taken. And it's extremely difficult for a worker's family to get school fees reimbursed for a child. It can take months. It may never happen. All those issues again need to be resolved. All those issues need to be addressed. But given that we have the infrastructure, I think this is the moment that we push states to deliver on whatever progressive legislation workers and workers' collectives and workers' struggles have actually won over the years. I think this is where we should be really putting our focus, putting our attention in the months to come. That's where I see most struggles of people's movements directed at. Just one thing I would like to say, Preeti had this question. Every other question here, Lakshmi has very comprehensively addressed. Preeti's question was about how do you use this pandemic as a portal? Of course, she is talking about making women's care work visible, but there are ways in which I think this pandemic has already served as a portal. I'm not talking about India so much. I'm talking about Europe, in which the idea of the welfare state has actually come back center stage. And I've been following debates of various groups in Europe who are now being able to push for the fact that there must be a wealth tax. Thomas Piketty talked about it in his book Capital in the 21st Century, saying there must be a global wealth tax, 15% every year, because increasing inequality has become obscene. And there's no way you can have a fair, decent living standard for all people when there is this kind of concentration of wealth. Now, that debate has been picked up and that has been finding a lot of resonance in the post-pandemic age. Right? And that's something that I think is positive. And what is also positive is I find in Europe, at least, I find citizens fighting and putting pressure on policymakers, on governments to put more money into healthcare, into medical services, into education post-pandemic. And I think this is a different trend from what we saw after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, right? That financial crisis meant that there was a defunding. There was a cutback. There was fiscal austerity. But that's not what we're seeing, at least the early signs. And that's because of citizen anger. There's a huge wave of anger. And that wave of anger is pushing governments to invest in health services, to deliver on welfare state commitments. So one might then see this pandemic as a portal from this point of view. I'm not exactly able to make a similar argument for India. Our problems are, I think, far more severe. We are losing constitutional rights during this pandemic. We find more of rights defenders going into prison rather than any positive change. But I'm saying from other parts of the world, there are ways in which the pandemic is serving as a portal, and that's also, I feel, a sign of hope.
So which country in Europe, Kalpana, are you referring
Scandinavian countries, sorry, not in Tamil, in Scandinavian countries, one has, I've come across this debate. I've also, in Spain, I'm also referring to the fact that what is the name of that party? It starts with P. It's the Spanish Workers' Party, which is part of the center-left coalition that Podesta or something, which the Spanish government has. And it was they who pushed the government to nationalize hospitals and clinics. Yeah. So in Spain, it's the regional governments that have been controlling hospitals and clinics. And to ensure that there is better coordination between the public and the private sector in order to cope with the pandemic, that pressure has come from within the parliament because of the center-left coalition that Spain has had. I also have in mind the Progressive International Group that is, with Noam Chomsky, and others, that is sort of supposed to be having its first meeting in September this month, in which a large number of activists, political organizers, some ministers on the left, people like Noam Chomsky, thinkers and intellectuals are sort of seizing this initiative to drive forward an understanding of what kind of alternative political economy we must put in place. So I'm sort of seeing all that as possibilities of openings, in which neoliberal models of capitalist development or extractive capitalism are maybe, I mean, they were always questioned. They were being questioned right through the 2000s, but maybe they're finding resonance amongst a wider audience now than they have been doing so far. So that's something that I'm seeing. Yeah.
We're almost at the end of our time,
Sorry.
but I have one more question. No. We're here to listen to you. One more question that I'm going to put there, and also simultaneously do my closing bit, and then leave it to you to address to the I think we're okay to go another 10 minutes, at least from our end. But if the panelists have to leave, then we'll wrap. The last question is from Dr. Shakti. Should we conceive of precarity as always being a negative force, or is there a way to define it as also being potentially generative of positive systemic change? And Kalpana, you've begun answering that. Can it push us to look at society in new and disruptive ways? And I will also just say my thank yous here for getting this series of webinars off to such a wonderful start, in case people have to leave while you're answering this, and then I can repeat myself again.
Yeah. No, I think the response that Kalpana had given basically is showing if there is a political commitment to use the pandemic to understand precarity and work towards removing it or mitigating it, then there is a possibility, right? But if we stay in denial and not really see the problem, for example, Parliament has begun yesterday, and there were questions about migrant workers, and the response is that there was fake news about some problem. That's why the workers had assembled in large numbers, but otherwise there was no problem. So there is a systematic denial of what we keep seeing. So tomorrow we might hear that all the workers who were walking on the national highways were actually people who had taken a challenge to get into the Guinness Book of World Records or Limca Book of Records. So they are passionate people who want to show that they can walk. Any explanation may come up. So the point is, are we in it all together really? We say we're all of us are in it together. Are we really in it together really? And then do we really believe that we have to build better? Okay, if you're saying build better post-COVID, how are we going to build better? From whose point of view are we going to build better? And who is at the core of what this nation is all about, right? If those questions are being asked by all the important people in this country, then we would definitely have a world, a country that is reimagining itself and recasting itself, where it recognizes its people, and values them. Now it does not seem to be doing that. So there is therefore that concern about, how do we do it, and what is it that we can do, and who are we, and how are we going to work? As academic institutions, we are all now supposed to be wrapping our head around the new educational policy, which has come up with lots of very interesting Atmanirbhar ideas for education. So I think there are multiple, we are in a matrix, we don't know what is hitting us from where. So hopefully, with more conversations of this kind, we will foreground the feminist views and feminist perspectives as often and as frequently and in as many places as possible. and try and push the envelope and keep trying. Thank you very much.
Kalpana?
I have nothing to add. I think that was a fantastic, very fitting end by Lakshmi. So, yeah.
I'm really glad there are 3 more of these, so I don't get to stop the conversation here. So many of these issues have been going through our heads. Some of us work in relatively greater isolation since the beginning of this crisis. And it's wonderful to listen to you both and have you bring different examples and different frames and a different vocabulary to this. And I hope that we will get to do this again with you.